on a wider scale, what David's done by his radical walks is brought to life what happened in various places. I mean, obviously, Cable Street and the fantastic events that went on there, but also other places like Battersea Arts Centre, which was the centre of where Saklatvala stood for and won election. Copenhagen Street and the fields there where the Peasants' Revolt arrived in Highbury also, as well as the Chartists in Copenhagen Street. All those things that have just been brought to life by David. And what I notice around the country over the last few years, I've been travelling around Britain for all of my life, doing meetings, rallies, demonstrations, picket lines and support. And I just go to the same things now, but there's usually more people there, which is fun. But there is there's a thirst for understanding our history and our knowledge. And that, I think, is very good and very, very empowering. There was a time when the Tolpuddle Martyrs Festival was a relatively small event. Relatively small. I went there as a young person. I went with my mum and dad, and it was quite a small event. Then it grew and grew and grew. And now it's tens of thousands of people at a 3-day festival talking about, yes, of course, the Tolpuddle Martyrs and what they went through and the significance of their contribution to our history, but also an awful lot of other struggles such as the swing riots and all the way in which the industrialisation of agriculture in the 1820s and 1830s led to such tension and such pressure and such desperate poverty, as well as a great fight back. So what David does is brings history to life all across London. The contribution made by all the migrant communities that have come and made London what it is, the struggles they went through, the racism they endured, and the fight back against that racism. And as David always points out, those that stood up against the fascists in Cable Street were the Irish and the Jewish community together, because they saw a commonality of interest in the way that they were being abused by the fascists. And there is now the rise of the far right across Britain and across Europe in at one level, a totally terrifying way. They are doing what the fascists and the far right always do, blaming the nearest handy minority, be they refugees, migrant workers, black community, Asian community, Jewish community, any community they can blame, and all they do is create a sense of hatred. But if we're empowered and our children are empowered by the history of what's been achieved by those that stood up, however difficult and unpopular the cause is, things change and we have a newly empowered next generation. If we study history through the narrative of kings and queens and wars and so forth, it's interesting, it's fascinating. I'm constantly fascinated by history. Actually, the Daily Mail says I never read a book. It's simply not true. It's just, I'm sure it was just a mistake on their part. You know how these mistakes grow. But we are empowered by the history of ordinary people. Who brought about the great social reforms? Who brought about the end of the slave trade? Who brought about the case of the rent regulation, the Mary Barber law? It was the struggles of ordinary people. And I'll finish on this point because it's something about history. When William Hague wrote his book about William Wilberforce, he gave me a copy because he'd heard me speaking about the slave trade in Parliament. And I said, well, it's very kind of you to give me a copy, but I don't really agree with your analysis. And he said, well, that's why I've given you a copy of it. I said, well, that's very kind of you. Thank you very much. I said, but Wilberforce, yes. Of course, he introduced the legislation that helped to bring an end to the slave trade and ultimately to slavery in what was then called the British Empire. The reality was the slave trade and slavery ended because of the Morant Bay uprising and all the other uprisings by slaves all over the world. And again, what David's books do is point out that this is where freed slaves lived in London. You're then excited by that interest, and suddenly a whole vista of history opens for young people to understand where they've come from and what they can achieve by their own actions, their own unity and their strengths. And so I'm absolutely delighted you've got another edition of the book out. I look forward to reading it, and I want to say a huge thank you to you and Julia for being such fantastic friends, such fantastic people, and so inspirational to so many others to be strengthened by our history, strengthened by our past, and strengthened by our good friendship and comradeship. Thank you very much. Thank you. I was very